You also have Donald Trump giving a deadline around 10 days, saying to get a deal, otherwise he might take action. Of course, Donald Trump has in the past given these deadlines and then actually taken action before the deadline is over. So there are some who think he could move as soon as this weekend. The truth is we don't know, but we do know Donald Trump likes to surprise on foreign policy.
Sunday Times Washington editor Katy Balls joins me from Washington now. Katy, hell of a setback for Donald Trump with the Supreme Court decision on tariffs. What's he going to do now?
Well, he's already announced some of the things he might do. So, first, a 10% global tariff effectively. But he doesn't have the same tools that he thought he had just, a few months ago. I think it's fair to say this is obviously very difficult for Donald Trump and it throws a lot of his plans up there, but it's also been anticipated. I think ever since the court case has been working its way through the courts into the Supreme Court, there was a sense in the White House they had a good chance of losing it when you saw what various judges were saying. So it meant when this did finally happen, you had a press conference in the White House with Donald Trump where he announced that he was going to keep going, he was going to let go of his tariffs, and he had lots of things to do. Now, it's true he has some cards still to play, but of course he doesn't have the same flexibility on tariffs that he had or he thought he had when he returned to the White House. And that means he is having to use things such as, for example, this 10% global tariff, which he can actually only really keep in place, I think, for 150 days unless he gets Congress's approval. And that seems very unlikely at the moment, particularly if you think ahead to the midterms in November, where the general expectation in DC is that the Democrats will take back the House.
And it was a Conservative majority, wasn't it, on the Supreme Court?
Yes, there were 6 judges in the Supreme Court. They were appointed by Republican presidents. 3 of whom were specifically appointed by Donald Trump. So this has, I think, added to the pain that the president and his team are feeling. And you saw in that press conference on Friday where he was really saying, oh, well, the Democrat judges, I can't even really go for them, but the disloyalty. And I think that there is a sense that the White House thought they could do these things because they would have judges on side. And actually, there are the checks and balances which you have in the US system, which haven't completely gone away. And Donald Trump is now having to reckon with.
Yeah, there are presumably checks and balances on whether he can launch an all-out war against Iran, which is what it's looking more likely at the moment. Except that we have heard this kind of bluster and threat before from Trump, haven't we? Where do you think we are with it?
Well, I think what has changed, because of course we have spoken about this in recent weeks, as you say, is that you look at the fact that military, Navy power, you have in terms of military, you have the most amassed since 2003 around the area, which does suggest that it could be close to something. You also have Donald Trump giving a deadline around 10 days, saying to get a deal, otherwise he might take action. Of course, Donald Trump has in the past given these deadlines and then actually taken action before the deadline is over. So there are some who think he could move as soon as this weekend. The truth is we don't know, but we do know Donald Trump likes to surprise on foreign policy. And I think that the level of movement when it comes to ships, machinery to, surrounding Iran, I don't you'd just do that just to purely try and get in someone's head. It's clearly something they're considering, particularly and then gets to the question of can you do a limited military strike as a way to, bounce the Iranian regime into a position where it doesn't escalate. That's what the US side, I think, would like to do if they took action, but obviously it's easier said than done.
Are they cross with us?
Well, I think there's always someone in Magaland who's cross with the UK, but often in a more "we're disappointed in you" type of way. They thought we'd be more aligned, or we've lost our way. Or at least that's what I find when I walk around. But specifically on the Chagos Islands and Iran and strikes, I think there is frustration on the UK side, and you could see that this week when Donald Trump took to Truth Social, and he had already criticised the Chagos deal. We've had very mixed messages from the US administration. Donald Trump criticized it. The State Department put out a statement saying they're working with the UK on this deal. But this was a pretty comprehensive evisceration of the Chagos Islands deal. And then my colleague Oliver Wright from the Times reported how there are frustrations because the UK government has been suggesting that the US side cannot use RAF bases for strikes on Iran necessarily because of international law, which I think has been a frustration. But then I also think the Chagos Islands deal more widely has been the subject of a lot of lobbying by a lot of politicians in the UK, trying to tell their various contacts in DC this is a bad deal. So I think it was bubbling up for a long time. But certainly, if the US is annoyed at or frustrated at the UK government for something, they're less likely to help the UK government out when it comes to, an unpopular deal that they're asking for diplomatic support on.
And yet he seems to have changed his mind on Chagos with every day that passes. I mean, this seems to me at least the third volte-face he's made on Chagos, which is saying it was all down to wokeism, which I suspect is certainly in there. But previously has said it's fine, and then before that said it was awful, and then before that said it was fine. There's no consistency, is there?
No, but I think there's also, when you look at it, you're completely right to say he has gone back and forth on this. But I also think there's been a fact where if you look at the timeline of the Chagos Islands deal, I don't think it's always been the case that it's been that clear that Donald Trump knew exactly all the details of the deal. And therefore, as time has gone on, it feels as though he and more people have lobbied, whether it is the Tories, Nigel Farage, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, more people that have tried to focus minds, and also things like Iran have focused minds. There was a moment, for example, after he first criticised it, and that was around the time of anger at the UK government for criticising the US on Greenland, where he was at a press briefing and he was asked by Harry Cole from The Sun about the Chagos Islands deal, and he said something along the lines of, "I don't know why they're selling it. Do they need the money?" Not apparently realizing that we're actually paying billions to give it away and then lease it back. So I think part of this is, at what point does Donald Trump know what he knows? And therefore, he could, of course, change his mind again. But I think with every outburst against the Chagos Islands deal and every time he points out more problems of it, he himself is discovering more and it gets harder to walk back from.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, he's got his first State of the Union address of his second term on Tuesday. Aside from braggadocio, what's he going to say? Aside from, saying how utterly brilliant he's been as a president, what actual stuff is he likely to come out with?
Well, I think to think of it in the way which is that we know that Donald Trump is obviously looking ahead to the midterms, and the White House really want a domestic policy focus on that. And that is something where there was a meeting this week where they gathered, top members of the cabinet and their advisors in a private members club in the DC to talk about talking points and how to focus on affordability, things they could sell to voters. So I think that when you're thinking about what he wants to focus in on and what his team would like him to focus in on, of course, he can go off script. I think trying to bring this all back to what voters in America are thinking about, which is less about Iran and more about how much money they have left in their pockets and what this government is delivering for them. And therefore, we're heading to a very political year in that sense.
Yeah, indeed, I bet. Katy, thanks ever so much. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And you can read Katy Balls in the Sunday Times tomorrow, or with a digital subscription via thetimes.com, and listen to her on the State of It USA podcast, co-hosted by the Wall Street Journal's excellent Gerard Baker. Search for it wherever you get your podcasts or listen via the Times radio app.